A wedding. A hidden past. A truth that shatters everything. Dr. Nate Carter never expected to see her again, the woman who vanished from his life a decade ago without a trace. But there she was, walking down the aisle, as the bride of his best friend. Secrets unravel. Love and betrayal collide, and one impossible choice will change everything. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Subscribe now so you never miss another unforgettable story. Dr. Nathaniel Nate Carter had never been one for grand celebrations, least of all weddings. They were elaborate performances, full of forced pleasantries and empty traditions. He had spent years burying himself in work, immersing himself in the only thing that made sense: medicine. A world where problems had solutions, where precision and skill could fix what was broken. But life was far less predictable than surgery, and love, as he had learned the hard way, was something far beyond his control. So when the wedding invitation arrived, a sleek, cream-colored envelope with gold-embossed letters, his first instinct was to toss it aside. He assumed it was from a colleague or a former patient trying to include him in their joy, but one glance at the names stopped him cold. Benjamin Reynolds and Catherine Hayes. Ben. His best friend. Nate ran a hand through his hair, scanning the invitation again as if he had misread it. When had this happened? The last time he had spoken to Ben, there had been no mention of a fiancé, no hint that he was even seeing someone seriously. He felt a sharp pang of guilt. Had he really let so much time pass without checking in? Ben had always been the outgoing one, the life of the party, the kind of man who thrived on social connection. It had always been a strange contrast to Nate, who had pulled further and further into solitude over the years. They had met in medical school, bonded over long nights of study and shared ambition. Ben had gone into orthopedic surgery while Nate pursued neurosurgery, yet despite their differences, their friendship had endured, or at least it had until Nate let the distance grow between them. He exhaled sharply, staring at the name of the bride. Catherine Hayes. The name meant nothing to him, but for some reason, as he read it, unease settled into his chest. For a brief moment, he considered not going. Weddings weren't his thing, and he could easily come up with an excuse. But that thought lasted only seconds before another, stronger one replaced it. Ben had always been there for him, through the worst nights of his life, through the aftermath of her. That was enough to make his decision. With a sigh, Nate tossed the invitation onto his desk. He would go, endure the speeches, the small talk, the inevitable questioning about why he was still single. He would be there for Ben, congratulate him, shake his hand, and then leave as soon as it was socially acceptable. One night. A few hours. That was all. The wedding day arrived faster than he expected. Nate spent the morning at the hospital, finishing a last-minute consultation with the patient. By the time he looked at the clock, he realized he barely had enough time to shower, change, and make it to the venue before the ceremony started. The estate where the wedding was being held was just outside the city. Grand, sprawling, the kind of place where people spent a small fortune to make their fairy tale moments come to life. It wasn't surprising. Ben had always had a taste for the extravagant. As Nate pulled up, a valet stepped forward, greeting him with a polished smile. He handed over his keys and strode toward the entrance, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. Inside, the decor was exactly what he expected: crystal chandeliers, flickering candlelight, pristine white linens. Conversations hummed in the background, glasses clinked, laughter echoed. Nate recognized a few faces from med school, colleagues of Ben's, but he wasn't in the mood for catching up. He navigated through the crowd quickly, relieved when he reached his assigned seat. At least for now, he could remain unnoticed. Another well-dressed guest among many. The ceremony was about to begin. A hush fell over the room as the music started, soft and elegant. The bridesmaids walked down the aisle first, followed by the flower girl and ring bearer. Then, the bride. Nate barely paid attention at first. He saw the white dress, the delicate veil, the graceful way she moved, and then something shifted. His breath caught, his stomach twisted. There was something about the way she carried herself, the way she tilted her chin, the way she moved. Familiar. His pulse quickened, his eyes locked onto her. He leaned forward slightly, as if seeing her more clearly would change what his mind was screaming at him. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. The bride reached the altar, standing beside Ben. The officiant began speaking, welcoming everyone to the ceremony, but Nate didn't hear a word of it. His ears were ringing, his vision narrowing on the woman before him. His fingers curled into fists. He was losing his grip on reality because there was no way that he knew this woman. And yet, the sheer veil covered most of her features, but he could see just enough. The curve of her lips, the way her hands clasped in front of her, the faint trembling in her fingers. Memories surged through him, 1,000 moments long, buried. A name pushed past his lips, silent and disbelieving. Isabel. The world spun. It had been 10 years. 10 years since she walked out of his life without an explanation. 10 years since he had searched for her, only to find nothing. 10 years of wondering, of trying to make sense of the impossible, of forcing himself to move on, even though he never truly had. And now she was here, marrying his best friend. His hand tightened on the chair. No, this was some kind of mistake, a sick joke. The officiant's words blurred into background noise as Nate struggled to breathe. His logical mind demanded answers. Coincidence? Someone who looked like her? But no, he knew. He knew. Then, as if the universe wanted to shatter any last doubt, the bride turned slightly. The lace of her gown shifted, revealing a small birthmark just above her collarbone. A birthmark he had traced with his fingers countless times. A birthmark he could never forget. His chest tightened. The air in the room felt suffocating. It was her, Isabel. She wasn't dead. She hadn't vanished into thin air. She was standing right there, a few feet away from him, wearing a wedding dress, about to vow herself to Ben. Nathaniel Carter had spent years trying to silence the ghosts of his past. But tonight, the past had found him first. Nate's mind refused to process what he was seeing. His rational instincts fought to dismiss it as some cruel illusion, a trick of the dim candlelight or his own subconscious playing games. But every nerve in his body screamed the truth. The woman standing at the altar was Isabel, his Isabel, and she was about to marry his best friend. He sat frozen in his chair, his breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps as the ceremony continued around him. The officiant's voice was little more than an echo in the background, drowned out by the pounding of his own heartbeat. The guests sat in quiet reverence, enraptured by the moment, oblivious to the storm raging inside him. Nate clenched his jaw, trying to hold himself together, but his hands curled into tight fists against his lap. He had spent years wondering what had happened to her, Years trying to accept the gaping hole she had left behind. He had searched at first, desperately, then methodically, but Isabel had vanished without a trace. No letters, no calls, no explanations. Just gone, as if she had never existed. And now, after a decade of silence, she was standing just a few feet away, dressed in white, looking serene and composed, as if the past had never happened. His stomach twisted violently. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. Yet every detail, the way she moved, the slight shift of her weight as she stood beside Ben, the graceful way she clasped her hands, it was all her. And then he saw it. A scar, faint but unmistakable, just above her hip, barely visible beneath the delicate lace of her gown as she adjusted her stance. Nate's breath caught in his throat. Years ago, Isabel had fallen while they were hiking together. Nothing serious, just a sharp rock that had left a small but permanent mark. He had been there when the doctors stitched her up. He had held her hand, kissed her forehead, reassured her as she laughed nervously about how much she hated the sight of her own blood. It was her. The realization hit him like a freight train. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a mistake. She was here. She had been here all along. The weight of it threatened to crush him. His best friend, Ben, the one person who had always stood by him, who had been there through the worst moments of his life, who had picked up the broken pieces of him after Isabel had disappeared, was standing at the altar, looking at her with pure, unguarded love, and she was letting him. Nate wanted to be wrong. He wanted someone to tap him on the shoulder and tell him he was imagining things. But deep down, he already knew. Isabel's back was turned to him, her face mostly obscured by the delicate veil, but her posture was tense. She was avoiding looking at him. She knew. She knew he was here. She knew he had recognized her. A sharp wave of nausea rolled through him. How was she capable of this? How could she have built an entirely new life, stood there beside another man, pretending as if the past had never existed, as if he had never existed? His thoughts spiraled, rage and confusion battling for dominance, but then, suddenly, she turned. It was brief, just a flicker of movement as she shifted slightly, her head tilting ever so slightly to the side. And in that moment he saw her eyes. For the first time in 10 years, Isabel met his gaze. The world around him disappeared. The officiant's words blurred into nothing, the wedding guests became faceless figures, the golden candlelight dimmed into irrelevance. There was only her, and the look in her eyes. It wasn't indifference. It wasn't confidence. It wasn't even relief. It was fear. A jolt shot through him, white-hot and electric. Isabel was terrified. Not nervous. Terrified. Nate's mind raced. If she had truly erased him from her past, if she had truly moved on, why did she look like she was about to collapse under the weight of her own secret? Why did she look as if she had been caught? Something was wrong. He barely registered the way her fingers trembled slightly as she held on to Ben's hands. He barely heard the officiant announcing the vows. He barely noticed the soft murmurs of the guests as they watched the ceremony unfold. All he could see was her. And in that moment, a dark, ugly realization took root in his mind. She wasn't just standing there with a new name, a new life, and a new future. She was lying. To Ben. To everyone in this room. To him. A slow, cold rage crept into his veins. Isabel had run from him once. She had shattered him once. And now, 10 years later, She had the audacity to stand at this altar, to pretend, to lie to his best friend's face. His hands tightened against his thighs, his breath coming out slow and controlled, but inside he was a storm on the verge of breaking. He had two options. He could stay silent, let her continue this deception, let the wedding play out, let Ben live in blissful ignorance of the woman he had just promised his life to. Or he could stop this, right here, right now. The officiant's voice became clear again, slicing through his thoughts. Do you, Catherine Hayes, take Benjamin Reynolds to be your lawfully wedded husband? Silence fell. Nate could hear his own pulse hammering against his skull. His entire body tensed, ready to rise, ready to call her out, ready to demand an explanation. Then Isabel spoke. I do. The words were soft, yet firm, but Nate heard something else buried beneath them. A tremor. He saw it too, the barely noticeable quiver in her fingers as she slipped the ring onto Ben's hand. Nate's vision darkened at the edges. She was lying, even now, even knowing he was sitting right here. Something inside him snapped. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The reception was in full swing by the time Nate forced himself to move. The wedding had happened, the vows had been spoken, the rings had been exchanged. Catherine, as she was now known, had kissed Ben in front of 100 people, sealing a lie with the soft press of her lips. And yet, Nate couldn't seem to pull his eyes away from her. From the outside, everything looked perfect. The ballroom glowed under the shimmer of golden chandeliers, casting long shadows against the walls as elegantly dressed guests laughed, clinked their champagne glasses, and celebrated what they believed was a joyous occasion. Ben was all smiles, standing at the center of it all, shaking hands, embracing old friends, basking in the happiness of a man who had just married the love of his life. Nate had never felt more like an outsider. His fingers tightened around the crystal tumbler in his hand, the bourbon inside untouched. He had taken a seat at one of the less crowded tables, strategically placed in the shadows where no one would bother him. His body was tense, his mind still reeling from the impossible reality of the situation. Every logical part of him told him to walk away, that this wasn't his fight, that Catherine, had made her choice and it no longer concerned him. But then he saw her again. Across the room, standing beside Ben, she was smiling, laughing at something someone had said. She looked happy, looked comfortable, looked like she belonged here, like she had always belonged here. And yet, Nate could see the cracks. Her laughter was too light, too rehearsed. The smile on her lips didn't reach her eyes. She wasn't looking at Ben the way a new bride should be looking at her husband. She was avoiding his gaze. But more than anything, she was avoiding Nate's. She knew. She knew that he knew. A flicker of movement caught his attention. Catherine? Shifted slightly, adjusting the delicate lace of her gown, and for a fraction of a second, the fabric pulled at just the right angle for him to see it again. The scar. His stomach clenched. The proof was right there in plain sight. She wasn't some stranger who just happened to resemble a ghost from his past. She was the ghost. She had lied to everyone. And now she was living that lie, right in front of him. The ice in his glass melted, the condensation dripping over his fingers as his grip tightened. His mind raced through possibilities. What was her plan? Had she ever intended for him to find out? Or had she thought she could go her whole life pretending that Isabel Carter no longer existed? He needed answers, and he wasn't leaving tonight without them. The opportunity presented itself sooner than he expected. Ben had been swept into conversation with a group of colleagues, distracted, his attention nowhere near his bride, and Catherine Isabel used that moment to slip away. She moved toward the edge of the ballroom, toward a pair of glass doors leading to the terrace outside. The night air was crisp, the distant hum of the city beyond the estate barely audible beneath the steady thrum of music from the reception. Nate didn't hesitate. He placed his untouched drink on the table, pushed back his chair, and followed her. His footsteps were silent as he stepped outside, the cool breeze a stark contrast to the warmth of the ballroom. She stood near the railing, her hands gripping the stone edge tightly, her shoulders tense. She didn't turn when he approached. That, more than anything, confirmed it. She was expecting him. For a long moment, he said nothing. He simply watched her, taking in the details, the way her fingers curled against the stone, the way her shoulders lifted slightly with each breath, the way she stood frozen, as if preparing for a battle she knew she couldn't win. Finally, he spoke. "Catherine?" Her back stiffened. A sharp inhale. But she didn't turn. Nate took another step forward, his voice quieter now, his next words laced with something heavier, something deeper. Or should I say, Isabel. This time, she reacted, a shuddering breath, the slight tremble in her hands. Slowly, painfully, she turned to face him, and there she was. For the first time in a decade, Isabel Hayes stood before him, no longer hidden beneath a veil of deception. She had changed. Her hair was different, longer, styled with soft waves framing her face. Her makeup was refined, elegant, more polished than he remembered. She looked older, more poised, like a woman who had carefully constructed the version of herself she wanted the world to see. But her eyes were the same deep hazel, the same quiet depth. And in this moment, they were filled with dread. She knew there was no running now. Nate held her gaze, searching her face for something. Remorse? Guilt? An apology? Instead, she whispered the words he had been waiting a decade to hear. "I didn't expect you to be here." His chest tightened. A bitter laugh threatened to escape. "Yeah, well, neither did I." Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. She swallowed, glancing away, her hands tightening around the railing. "No." His voice was sharper than he intended. "No excuses, Isabel, no running. Not this time." She flinched, just slightly. Good. He took another step forward, closing the distance between them. "Tell me why. Why did you leave? Why did you disappear without a trace? Why did you let me think?" He exhaled sharply, his control slipping. "Why did you let me think you were dead?" Her lips parted slightly, something flickering in her expression. "I didn't want you to find me." The words hit like a punch to the gut. His jaw clenched. A long pause, a war waged in her expression, as if she were battling against herself. Then, finally, she whispered, "Because I lost the baby." Everything in Nate stopped. His breath, his thoughts, his heartbeat. The baby. His baby. The world tilted. Isabel swallowed hard, forcing herself to look at him. "I was pregnant when I left. I thought I could do it alone. I thought I could figure it out. But I lost the baby, Nate. And then the doctors told me I couldn't." She cut herself off, her voice breaking. They told me I couldn't have children again. Nate couldn't breathe. You thought I wouldn't want you anymore, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Isabel looked away. A single tear slipped down her cheek. You always wanted a family, she murmured. You talked about it all the time. You wanted kids, a home, a life that I couldn't give you anymore. I didn't want you to stay out of pity, so I left. Nate felt something inside him crack. His hands clenched at his sides, his pulse hammering. You made that decision for me? She flinched again. You thought you had the right to decide what I wanted? You thought I would just... He let out a sharp, humorless laugh. You really thought I wouldn't have stayed? Her silence was his answer. Nate ran a hand over his face, trying to rein in the storm raging inside him. You're wrong, Isabel, he said, his voice low and rough. You were always wrong. She blinked back tears, her breathing shaky. I know. They stood there, the weight of the past pressing between them. And for the first time in a decade, Nate realized something terrifying. Even after all of this, even after the lies, the heartbreak, the betrayal, he still wasn't sure if he could walk away. Nate stared at Isabel, his chest tightening with emotions too tangled to name. The weight of her confession sat heavy between them, thickening the air, pressing into his ribs like a slow, relentless squeeze. She had been pregnant. She had lost the baby. And then she had left, severing every thread of their shared past, leaving him in the dark to search for answers that never came. And now, 10 years later, she stood before him, wrapped in white, wearing another man's ring. The silence between them stretched, brittle and sharp, filled with everything that had been lost. Isabel was the first to break it, her voice barely more than a whisper. I never wanted you to find out. Nate let out a sharp, humorless laugh, running a hand through his hair. That much is obvious. His pulse hammered against his skull, a furious, erratic rhythm. But you didn't just disappear, Isabel. You erased yourself. You made sure I'd never be able to find you. His voice was rough, edged with something dangerously close to anger. Do you have any idea what that did to me? Her eyes flickered with pain, but she didn't look away. I do, she admitted softly. And I'm sorry. Sorry. That word felt so small compared to the years he had spent trying to piece himself back together. He let out a slow breath, trying to steady himself. Then tell me the truth now. Why did you leave? Really? She swallowed hard, gripping the railing tighter, as if the cool stone beneath her fingers could ground her. Because I was scared. Nate didn't move. He just watched her, waiting. She exhaled shakily, closing her eyes for a brief moment before opening them again. I was scared of what losing the baby would do to us. I was scared of watching you look at me differently. I was scared of holding on to something that was already broken. She let out a bitter, trembling laugh. And I thought if I left first, it would hurt less. His jaw clenched. Did it? She met his gaze, and there it was. Regret. No, she whispered. It didn't. Nate took a slow step closer. Then why didn't you come back? His voice was raw now, scraping against the night air. Why didn't you call? Why didn't you tell me the truth before you decided to marry my best friend? She flinched at that, her fingers tightening on the railing. I didn't plan this, she said, her voice quiet but firm. I didn't expect to fall in love with someone else. I didn't expect... She cut herself off, shaking her head. I tried to move on, Nate. I built a new life. I thought if I started over, I could finally let go of everything. His heart pounded at those words. And did you? Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. And that hesitation, that single, fleeting moment of doubt, told him everything. She hadn't. She had tried, but she hadn't let go. Nate let out a slow, heavy breath. Does Ben know? She hesitated, then shook her head. A bitter laugh escaped him. Of course he does. The sound of distant laughter floated from the ballroom behind them, completely at odds with the storm raging inside Nate's chest. He turned away briefly, dragging a hand down his face, trying to process the impossible weight of the situation. His best friend was inside, drinking champagne, celebrating what was supposed to be the happiest day of his life. And out here, just beyond the warm glow of the chandeliers, the truth was unraveling, pulling at every carefully constructed lie, until there was nothing left but raw, exposed wounds. He turned back to her, his voice quieter now. You have to tell him, Isabel. Her breath hitched. I can't. You can't, or you won't. She swallowed, looking away. He shook his head. You don't get to do this to him. You don't get to stand at that altar, say your vows, and pretend. He deserves better than that. Her eyes snapped back to his, desperate now. Please, Nate, she whispered. Please, don't do this. He stared at her, his pulse roaring in his ears. I'm begging you, she continued, her voice breaking. Just let this go. Let me go. He had spent 10 years trying to do just that. And yet, here he was. The ache in his chest deepened, twisting into something almost unbearable. Because, despite everything, despite the years, despite the lies, he still loved her. God help him, but he did. Nate took a slow step back, his hands clenching into fists. I can't, he said. A sharp breath escaped her lips, almost like a sob. Then what are you going to do? She whispered. Nate looked past her, through the glass doors, to where Ben stood inside the ballroom, completely unaware of the wreckage waiting for him just outside. He deserved to know, even if it destroyed him, even if it destroyed all of them. Nate met Isabel's gaze one last time, and then, with his heart pounding, he turned and walked back inside. Nate moved through the ballroom like a man walking toward destruction. His chest was tight, his mind a tangled mess of anger, disbelief, and something deeper, something dangerously close to heartbreak. The golden chandeliers shimmered overhead, casting warm, flickering light over the celebration, but he felt none of it. His pulse pounded in his ears as he wove through the tables, his eyes locked onto Ben. His best friend stood near the bar, laughing, his drink raised in a toast with a few old college friends. Completely unaware, completely blind to the truth. Nate's stomach twisted. How was he supposed to do this? How was he supposed to look Ben in the eye and tell him that the woman he had just married, the woman he loved, wasn't who she claimed to be? That she had erased her past, rewritten her identity, and left behind a trail of broken promises and shattered hearts? But there was no turning back now. He heard the soft rustle of fabric behind him, felt the weight of a stare burning into his back. But he didn't turn around. He knew it was Isabel. He could feel her presence like a ghost at his heels, silent but desperate. She didn't want this. She wanted him to walk away. But Nate wasn't that man. He never had been. Ben caught sight of him approaching and grinned, raising his glass in greeting. "Hey, you finally decided to join the fun." His voice was light, filled with the warmth of a man whose world was still intact. "For a second I thought you'd slipped out early. You always hated these things." Nate forced himself to stop a few feet away, his breath coming slower now, more controlled. Ben's smile faltered slightly as he studied him. "What's wrong?" Nate swallowed. The words were right there, lodged at the back of his throat like glass, but before he could speak, another movement flickered at the edge of his vision. Isabel. She had followed him inside, stopping just a few feet away. She wasn't close enough to interrupt, but close enough to plead. Her eyes met his, wide and filled with silent desperation. "Don't do this." Nate's jaw tightened. He turned back to Ben. "It's about Catherine." Ben frowned, lowering his glass slightly. "What about her?" Nate inhaled sharply, steadying himself. There was no soft way to say this, no way to ease into it. "She's not who you think she is." The words cut through the noise of the room like a blade. Ben blinked, his confusion deepening. "What?" Nate glanced toward Isabel, who was frozen. Then back to Ben. "She's not Catherine Hayes," Nate said, his voice firm. "Her real name is Isabel. Isabel Hayes." The shift in Ben's expression was immediate. His brows furrowed, his mouth opening slightly as if trying to process what he had just heard. A slow, disbelieving laugh escaped him. What the hell are you talking about?" Nate didn't flinch. "She changed her name, changed her life." His voice remained steady, but inside, he felt like he was standing on the edge of something irreversible. "She left me 10 years ago without a word, and now she's here, standing in front of you, pretending she's someone else." Ben's face darkened. He turned sharply toward Isabel, waiting for her to deny it. She didn't. Her silence was louder than any confession. The color drained from Ben's face. "Isabel," he said slowly, the name foreign on his tongue. His voice was quiet now, strained. "Tell me this is a mistake." She swallowed hard. "Ben?" His expression twisted. "Tell me he's wrong." Her lips parted, her breath shaky. But she couldn't say it, and that was all the confirmation Ben needed. His grip on the glass tightened before he set it down with deliberate care. His movements were slow, measured, the way a man reacts when he's just realized the ground beneath him is crumbling. "How long?" he asked, his voice eerily calm. Isabel flinched. "Ben, how long have you known?" he repeated, but this time his eyes were on Nate. Nate met his gaze head-on. "I recognized her at the ceremony." Ben let out a bitter, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "Of course you did." His expression twisted with something raw, something that looked dangerously close to betrayal. "And you waited until now to tell me?" "I needed to hear the truth from her first," Nate admitted. Ben exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. His new wife stood motionless beside him, her hands trembling slightly, her face pale. "You were going to tell me, right?" Ben asked suddenly, looking back at her. His voice was quiet, but it carried weight. Hope. Isabel opened her mouth, hesitated, then whispered, "I didn't know how." Ben staggered back as if the words had physically hit him. "Oh, that's rich," he said, a bitter edge creeping into his voice. He let out a sharp laugh. "You didn't know how." "That's funny, because it didn't seem so hard to lie about it." Isabel's eyes glossed over with unshed tears. It wasn't a lie. Ben scoffed. Oh, really? Then what the hell was it? I wanted to start over, she said desperately. I wasn't trying to erase my past, I wanted a clean slate. A chance to be someone who wasn't defined by everything I lost. Ben shook his head, stepping back again, putting space between them. You should have told me. His voice had dropped to a whisper now. Her lip trembled. I know. Silence settled between them, heavy and suffocating. Then finally Ben turned toward Nate. His eyes searched his face, as if looking for something. An explanation, a reason, anything that could make sense of this. Instead, all he found was the wreckage. You did the right thing, Ben said quietly, his voice tired, resigned. Nate nodded, but he didn't feel victorious. There was no victory here. Ben took a slow, measured breath. Then he turned back to Isabel. I need some time. She nodded, blinking back the tears that were threatening to spill. I understand. Without another word, Ben walked away. Not in anger, not in fury, but in devastation. And for the first time in years, Nate saw it. The exact moment when a man's heart breaks. The moment Ben walked away, the weight of the evening crashed down on Nate like a collapsing building. He had expected anger, maybe even violence, a shove, a punch, something. Instead, Ben had simply left. No explosion, no accusations, just raw devastation. And somehow, that was worse. The ballroom continued buzzing with laughter and music, completely oblivious to the quiet wreckage unfolding on its outskirts. To them, it was still a night of celebration, a joyous occasion filled with toasts and dancing. They didn't see the cracks forming, the fault lines splitting apart right beneath their feet. Nate stood in the center of it all, his body rigid, his mind reeling. Isabel was still there, motionless, watching Ben disappear into the crowd. Her hands trembled at her sides, her face pale, her breath uneven. But she didn't go after him. She didn't try to stop him, because she knew. It was over. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until finally Isabel turned toward Nate. Her eyes found his, and for the first time that night, he saw her completely. No carefully constructed mask, no pretense of composure, just raw, unguarded emotion. You shouldn't have done that, she whispered. Nate let out a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He deserved the truth. A sharp, bitter laugh escaped her lips. And what about me? She asked, her voice shaking. Did I deserve this? His jaw tightened. You deserved to be honest from the start. You should have told him yourself, Isabel. You should have told me. She flinched at that, her gaze flickering downward. I know, she admitted softly. But I was scared. Nate clenched his fists. Yeah, his voice was quiet, but edged with something dark. So was I. When you disappeared, when I spent years wondering what I did wrong, wondering if you were even alive. You were scared? He took a step closer, his pulse roaring in his ears. Well, congratulations. So was I. Her breath caught. Her fingers curled into the fabric of her gown, as if trying to steady herself. I never meant to hurt you, she whispered. Nate let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Then you have a funny way of showing it. She exhaled shakily, pressing a hand against her temple. You don't understand. Then make me, he cut in. His voice was firm, unrelenting. Because I have spent the last 10 years drowning in the questions you left behind, and I am done waiting for answers." Her lips parted slightly, as if to argue, but then something in her crumbled. The fight left her shoulders, the tension drained from her spine, and suddenly she wasn't standing before him as Catherine Hayes, the perfect bride, the woman who had carefully rebuilt herself into someone new. She was just Isabel, the woman who had left, the woman he had once loved, the woman who had broken him. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back quickly, sucking in a deep breath. "When I lost the baby," she began, her voice uneven, "I lost myself, too. I didn't know how to exist without that future, without you, without everything we had planned." She shook her head, her throat tightening. "I didn't leave because I stopped loving you, Nate. I left because I was afraid that if you stayed, you would never stop resenting me. That every time you looked at me, you would only see what we lost." His chest ached. "That wasn't your choice to make," he said quietly. Her eyes flickered with pain. "I know," she admitted. "But at the time, it felt like the only way to protect both of us." Nate exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his hair. "And now," she let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head. "Now I realize that I've spent 10 years running from a mistake that was never mine to fix. That I tried to erase my past instead of facing it. And now," she glanced toward the empty space where Ben had stood, her throat tightening. "Now I've destroyed everything." A heavy silence fell between them. Nate didn't know what to say. He had wanted this, wanted the truth, wanted her to admit the damage she had done. And yet, standing here, watching her break apart in front of him, he didn't feel victorious. He just felt tired. "I don't know what you expect me to say, Isabel," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "You made your choices, and so did I." She swallowed, her gaze searching his. "So what happens now?" Nate let out a slow breath, glancing back toward the ballroom. "I don't know," he said honestly. Her lips trembled. He should have walked away then. He should have let her figure out her own mess. But instead, against every ounce of logic screaming at him to let go, he reached out. Gently, carefully, he brushed his fingers against hers. She inhaled sharply at the contact, her eyes snapping up to his. And for a single, fleeting moment, just like that, it was them again. Just Nate and Isabel. No past, no lies, no wreckage. Just two people standing in the aftermath, still trying to hold on. But the moment shattered as quickly as it came. Isabel pulled back first, her breath shaky. "I should go," she whispered. Nate nodded, the ache in his chest tightening. "Yeah," he murmured. "You should." She hesitated for just a second longer. Then, with one final glance, she turned and walked away. And this time, Nate let her go. Nate stood there long after Isabel had disappeared, his hands still clenched at his sides, his heart hammering against his ribs. The cold night air did nothing to cool the heat rushing through his veins. His mind was still stuck in the moment, the way her voice had trembled, the way her fingers had brushed against his like a whisper from a past he could never quite escape. But it was over now. Or at least it should have been. The ballroom doors swung open behind him, spilling laughter and the soft hum of music into the night. The celebration continued as if nothing had changed, as if an entire life hadn't just unraveled beyond those doors. The weight of it all settled heavy in his chest as he turned toward the reception hall, his gaze sweeping the room in search of Ben. He spotted him near the far wall, away from the dancing and the toasts, his shoulders stiff, his drink untouched in his hand. Nate took a breath and started toward him. Ben didn't acknowledge him at first, staring blankly at the amber liquid in his glass, his jaw tight. Nate knew him well enough to recognize the storm brewing beneath the surface, the way his grip tensed, the way his chest rose and fell in slow, measured breaths. The only thing keeping him from breaking. Nate stopped a few feet away, waiting. For a long time, Ben said nothing. Then, finally, his voice came, low and flat. "You should have told me sooner." Nate swallowed hard. "I know." Ben let out a breath, shaking his head. "Jesus, Nate." He finally turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "How long did you know?" "Really?" Nate held his gaze. "I suspected when I saw her walk down the aisle, but I knew for sure when I saw the scar." Ben let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "Of course." He shook his head, looking away. "And she just let me stand up there, saying my vows, making promises to a woman who wasn't even real." Nate didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. Ben exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face. "The worst part?" His voice was quieter now, raw. "I keep going over it in my head. All the moments that should have tipped me off. The way she never really talked about her past. The way she always changed the subject when I asked about where she grew up. And I ignored it. I told myself it didn't matter, that she'd tell me when she was ready." He let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Turns out, she was never planning to." Nate shifted on his feet, his stomach twisting. Ben turned to him again, searching his face. "Did she ever love me?" Nate hesitated. He thought back to the terrace, to the way Isabel had struggled to answer that very question. He could still hear the hesitation in her voice, the flicker of guilt in her expression. "She wanted to," he said honestly. "I think she really tried." Ben's lips pressed into a thin line, his throat working as he swallowed hard. "Yeah," he murmured, nodding slowly. "That's what I thought." Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Then, after a long moment, Ben let out a slow, steady breath. "I need to get out of here." Nate nodded. "I get it." Ben glanced toward the crowd, toward the guests still laughing and dancing, still blissfully unaware that the man they were celebrating was barely holding himself together. "I don't even know what I'm supposed to say to them," he admitted. His voice was hoarse, exhausted. "What do you tell people when your wife turns out to be a stranger?" Nate exhaled through his nose. "You don't owe anyone an explanation." Ben let out a quiet, bitter laugh. "No, but they'll want one anyway." He shook his head, rubbing a hand over his face. "God, I feel like a fucking idiot." "You're not," Nate said firmly. Ben let out a sharp breath. "Yeah, because right now, I feel like I let a complete stranger into my life. Like I let her lie to me for years without even realizing it." Nate didn't have an answer for that. Because the truth was, Ben had. But so had he. And maybe, in some twisted way, that was why this hurt so much. Because for all of Isabel's secrets, for all of the lies and the missing years, Nate had still recognized her. He had still seen through the cracks, had still known. Ben hadn't. And that, more than anything, was what shattered him. Ben exhaled sharply, straightening. His jaw was still tight, his eyes still dark with pain, but he was regaining control, piecing himself back together, layer by layer. I need time, he said finally, looking at Nate. I need space. I can't even think right now. Nate nodded. Take as long as you need. Ben studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slow, exhausted breath, he nodded and turned away, disappearing into the crowd. Nate watched him go, a strange hollowness settling into his chest. Because for the first time in his life, he didn't know if his best friend would ever come back. Nate stood there long after Ben had disappeared into the crowd, his body rigid, his mind a tangled mess of emotions he wasn't ready to untangle. The ballroom continued to hum with celebration, the soft melody of the band blending seamlessly with the laughter of guests who had no idea what had just unfolded in the shadows. But for Nate, the night had already ended. Everything felt surreal, as if the floor beneath him had shifted just slightly, out of sync with reality. He had spent the last decade searching for answers, for closure that had always eluded him. And now, in the span of a single night, he had found it. Only, it didn't feel like closure. It felt like wreckage. He turned toward the glass doors leading back to the terrace, drawn to the quiet, away from the suffocating noise of the reception. The cool night air hit his skin the moment he stepped outside, but it did nothing to ease the storm inside him. And then he saw her. Isabel? She stood near the edge of the terrace, her arms wrapped around herself, her posture tense. She wasn't crying. She wasn't falling apart, but he could see it. The way her fingers clutched the fabric of her gown, the way her shoulders trembled slightly in the moonlight. She was unraveling. Slowly, he stepped toward her. She heard him approach, but didn't turn. Instead, she let out a soft, unsteady breath. Michael left, didn't he? Nate stopped a few feet away, his jaw tightening. Yeah. A hollow laugh escaped her lips. I figured he would. Silence stretched between them, heavy with everything that had been said and everything that hadn't. Nate studied her carefully, his mind still trying to make sense of the impossible. The woman standing before him was both a stranger and the most familiar person he had ever known. He should have walked away. He should have let her go. Instead, he found himself asking, "Why did you say yes?" She stiffened slightly, finally turning to face him. Her hazel eyes met his, and for a moment, he forgot how to breathe. "What?" she asked quietly. To Michael, Nate clarified, his voice steadier than he felt. "Why did you agree to marry him?" She let out a slow breath, her fingers tightening around the railing. "Because it was easy." Nate's stomach twisted. Isabel looked away, staring out into the darkness beyond the terrace. "Because he didn't know my past. Because he didn't ask questions. Because for the first time in a long time, I could be someone else." She swallowed hard. "And I wanted that. I wanted to start over." "But it didn't work," Nate said. A bitter smile touched her lips. "No," she admitted. "It didn't." He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "So what now?" She looked at him again, searching his face for something, hesitation, doubt, uncertainty, but she wouldn't find any of that. Because for the first time in years, Nate knew exactly what he wanted. He took a slow step closer. "You asked me to walk away," he said quietly. She swallowed. "I don't think I can." Her breath hitched, but she didn't move. She didn't run. Instead, she held his gaze, searching for something. Hope, fear, an escape? But Nate didn't give her an escape. "I never stopped loving you," he admitted. Her lips parted slightly, her eyes widening just a fraction. He could see the battle happening inside her, the war between fear and hope. "You left me once," he continued, his voice firm but quiet. "I won't let you do it again." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't look away. "Nate, if you don't love me," he said, his heart pounding, "if you don't want this, tell me now. I'll leave. I'll let you go." She shook her head, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "I never stopped loving you either." His chest tightened. He had prepared himself for rejection, for the possibility that too much had happened, that too much had changed. But hearing her say it, hearing the truth that had been buried beneath a decade of silence, made everything else fade away. "Then don't run this time," he said. She let out a shaky laugh, brushing away a tear. "Where would I even go?" He smiled slightly. "Anywhere, but this time, I'll go with you." Her laughter turned into a quiet sob, and before he could think, she stepped forward, wrapping her arms around him. Nate held her tightly, burying his face in her hair, breathing her in. It felt like coming home after years of being lost. The world around them continued. Guests still danced, music still played. The wedding celebration carried on, oblivious to the fact that the original bride and groom were no longer together. And yet, in this moment, none of it mattered. This was their second chance, and this time neither of them was letting go. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. Sometimes, life takes us on unexpected detours, forcing us to face the ghosts of our past. Love, betrayal, regret, and redemption. These are all pieces of the human experience, woven together by the choices we make. If there's one lesson to take away from this story, it's that truth always finds a way to surface. No matter how deeply we bury it, no matter how far we run, the past doesn't disappear. We can either confront it or let it destroy us. Honesty, no matter how painful, is the foundation of trust, and without trust, love cannot survive. Have you ever faced a moment like this? A truth you had to tell, even knowing it could change everything? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if this story resonated with you. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another powerful story. More incredible narratives are on the way, and I can't wait to share them with you. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for letting these stories become a part of your world. See you in the next one.